right. We are just going to get started here in a few minutes. Let's give some time for people to join up. And if you are already here coming out of the waiting room, just let us know who you are and where you're from. I'd love to get a sense who's in the room. I'm in Portland, Oregon today. Just back from Austin. Had a great conference with a number of chief transformation officers at the Chief Transformation Officer Exchange earlier this week. So it was great to actually talk about this topic with some folks and get a sense. Ben, you're stuck in the Austin airport like a number of people I heard yesterday. Hey, Marjorie from New York, how are you? Good to see you here. Scotland, hello. Last week we had a farthest distance competition for a book, and I think Scotland would have definitely won. So thanks for joining us. Good evening to you. And Melody, yes, Austin. I just got out of the airport last night. My plane went west, and everybody that went east, I think, is still in hotels. Preben, hi from Copenhagen. Great to see you. In Germany, hello. Julie anchoring my northern Michigan homeland. And you rarely hear sunny Seattle from anybody. So good for you today, Jen. All right. Well, I think we're going to kick off. We've got a lot of content today. I know more people are joining, but we may as well just dive in. I am super excited about this topic today. This is, for me personally, one of the most important topics in change work, and it is about best practices for leading change from the C-suite. What I'd like to address today is really the topics of how do we really engage our executive leaders to help us accelerate change. I'm going to share some data and best practice on that topic. Before I do, I think most everybody here has actually been with us for the journey of this series of seven, but if there's anyone that's new, just briefly, I'm Aric Wood. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at Tigerhall and also the author of the Strategy Activation Playbook, which is where a lot of this content in this series comes from. That playbook was built on the experience of about 25 years of both working inside of a Fortune 500 company as well as working outside as an advisor, supporting change activation campaigns for large global organizations as the CEO of Explain, where we did change activation campaign design. So what we tried to do in the book, as well as especially today, is gather some of the best practices around what makes modern change effective. We're now in the last of our series of seven. So if you missed any of these, please go back, find the old links, or ask us if you can't find them, because we've gone through the process of thinking about how do we design change activation for the modern organization and shared some tools to do that. But today, really, what I want to focus on is this one very important topic. As I looked back across all of the dozens and dozens and dozens of programs that I was involved in, one thing really stood out to me, which is that the ones that are most effective, excuse me, the ones that are most effective and the ones that were successful were those change programs where executive leaders were day-to-day involved. And it almost is a one-to-one correlation. If I think about the projects that I saw go sideways, that didn't get back on track, that floundered, and then I look at the ones that were consistently moving towards the goal, the one most common unifying factor was that executive leaders were engaged, present, and visible in the process of leading this transformation. So, what we want to talk about today is we want to present sort of two archetypes of change leadership to build the spectrum of where leaders are, and you can start to think about it in your own organization and where you're sit. Secondly, we want to talk about the role of change leaders in realizing transformation ROI. So, what is the impact they really make? Like, is this lip service or is there data? So, we're going to talk about some data. And then lastly, we're going to share my own observations, sort of seven observations of best practices that I saw change leaders do that made them most effective in leading change. And then when we're done, we've got a few offers that we're going to share with you to help support your efforts. As I like to do first, I want to set the table by checking and seeing a little bit of the data that's in the room. I was saying that the smartest person in the room is the room. So collectively, I want to gather our collective intelligence here. I'd like you to address this question. In your own experience, what was the biggest point of failure for past change initiatives that you've experienced? So, as you think about the past change and transformations that you've seen, good and bad, for those that weren't successful, or for those that failed, for those that floundered, which of these were for you the biggest driver? And if none of these apply, hit other. But if you've got, any of these stand out, you can select up to three of these.
I'm going to give folks just a last minute to vote. All right, I think we're good.
Ian, we'll add that next time. It's a good one. All right, what do we got? Okay, look at this. Unrealistic timeline of scope, 31%, budget resource constraint, 44%, lack of leadership alignment, 75%. So this is the big one. Insufficient communication with stakeholders at 19. Inadequate training isn't really the problem, 6%. So other beat that. So for this group in particular, that lack of leadership alignment really stands out as the critical issue. I know there's an implicit bias because you all came to a webinar to talk about this topic, but this actually rings out. This rings true. So we actually did a survey with the Executive Council for Leading Change earlier in the year. I know a number of folks on the call are members to actually ask this question as well as a number of others to try to get a sense of where the big problems were. And the question we asked was a little bit different, but it was, what are the top three things that can actually sort of disrupt change? And what we heard from folks was very similar to yours. Lack of leadership alignment. Almost half of folks said, yeah, this is one of the biggest issues. So, along with unrealistic timeline and scope and budget constraints, lack of leadership alignment is in the top three reasons that our transformations are really challenged. So, and this is across, by the way, the audience for the data I'm about to share is 600 US transformation leaders, as well as a couple of hundred other folks that are outside of the US. So we got a pretty good sense of where the state of change is in 2025. The other things that I thought were really interesting in this data was that we asked the question around what groups are the hardest to engage in your current transformation efforts. And shockingly, for me at least, I guess it shouldn't have been shocking, but I was surprised to see the data so resounding, was that we said executive leaders and middle management are actually the hardest to engage in transformation efforts, right? Which, of course, if we think about it, oh, wow, no wonder we're challenged in getting change and transformation to be effective. If this is the group that's hardest to reach, one might think it might be those frontline employees, it might be just, distinct partnerships. No, it's actually this group. And the other thing that I thought was really remarkable is we asked a follow-up question to this, which was which stakeholder groups are most critical to engage in your current transformation efforts. And not only was it the same two audiences, but it was louder, right? We saw that, if you look back at the last piece of data, 63 and 36%, even more important to say 75% said we got to hit those middle managers. Those are so critical to our effort, and executive leadership next up. So these are really fascinating data points for us to keep in mind because these are clues to, well, what will make us effective? If we all agree that this is one of the biggest challenges, if we all agree that these are the most critical people to reach, and we agree these are the hardest people to engage, this is obviously one of the core problems to be solved if we want to put ourselves into that winning group of transformation leaders versus that 70 or 80% that fail. And you validated this in that for those that were in the ECLC, we said, okay, if you could wave a magic wand and you could have three wishes, what would your wishes be? This is exactly where we landed. Stronger executive leadership alignment and commitment was number one by and far, followed by those other two things. So we said, hey, this is really the critical issue. So this is a big part of why we're having this conversation today. We really need to start to talk about how do we start to make this change within the landscape of change so that we can be more effective in our transformation efforts. So with that data, let's set the table for sort of what we're up against. So I'd like to talk about two archetypes of leadership. This is probably a very familiar one to us. So the first archetype is what I call the delegator. This is the senior leader who basically takes that plan and throws it over the wall, says, "Hey, let me delegate this to the change teams. I've got a transformation team. I've got an OCM over here. I've got a comms team over here. I've got a learning and development group over here. Go make it happen." Right? And unfortunately, this is something that we see all too often. So we're seeing leaders that expect other people to manage the people side while they focus on the strategic goals or the business or the strategy, not recognizing that the people side is the business and the strategy and all of the sort of the hard stuff we talked about last week. So we see key behaviors like delegating change communications to others. They're not visibly leading by example and changing their own behaviors. They are confusing sponsorship with leadership. They're broadcasting, but they're not necessarily engaging, and they're not getting that two-way conversation that's necessary. And they're viewing change enablement as a support function. So, this sound familiar to folks? I bet. Yeah, there we go. Some reactions I saw. So, the other archetype that we want to set up is this one on the other end of the spectrum, which I'll call the activator. So, the activator, you can already see from this visual, is in it, right? Engaged, having conversations, two-way feedback, understanding what people are asking about, answering those questions, addressing those questions, or going back to engage those questions to figure out how we can develop answers for them. This is a leader that's changing from the front. They're not only sponsoring it, but they're really embodying it, right? So they're communicating consistently. They're always explaining the what and the why and where are we going and what's the vision and how are we going to get there. And they're engaging people to say, tell me what you think. What's working? What's not? What's resonating? So the key behaviors here are that they're communicating that vision that we talked about with clarity and authenticity in their own voice. They're showing up in front of employees to listen and engage. They're role modeling those desired behaviors consistently. They're supporting the change champions that are supporting the effort and making sure that those teams have what they need to be successful. And they're encouraging two-way dialogue and adaptation so that as we inevitably hit those snags, those roadblocks, those obstacles, the teams are empowered to make those changes and adapt quickly, which is what's going to keep the momentum and keep us moving forward. Now, we can probably put all of our leaders somewhere on a continuum between these two folks. Hopefully, we're all working with this example. I know a lot of us are working with the other example. Some are in between. The good news is that we as change agents can help tilt the scale in this direction as we move forward in the future. And we're going to get some data and some business cases to put together to actually help make that case and persuade folks to move towards this archetype. But we do need to understand where it comes from, right? So it's not just that leaders aren't smart, that they're not effective, they don't know what they're doing. Just as a quick background, the delegator, the one I say is so last century, comes about because in the last century, this was actually how most organizations worked, right? We had tops down hierarchical structures that were command and control. So the leader could just say, this is what we're going to go do it, and delegate middle managers to delegate it to frontline employees, and it cascaded through the organization, right? But that isn't the world we live in today. The world we live in now is organizations that are more organic. We've hired employees that are creative, that are innovative, that can think for themselves. But as a result, they're also discerning and they have agency. And so before they will go do a thing, we need to persuade them to go do that thing. We need to persuade them that this is better for the organization, this is better for me. I'll support you in giving you the skills and capabilities that you need to get to this new place. Come with me. So the activator is the archetype of now. The activator is the archetype of our modern organization. And what activators do really well is that they cultivate a movement, right? We can't force it, but cultivate is a selected word. We're cultivating a movement. We're recognizing that if we have a strong pipeline of leaders that are all seeing the same vision and wanting to move in the same direction, if we built solid partnerships across our organization, across those various groups with L&D, with comms, with our exterior partners, with our business partners, and we have a very clear shared goal and plan for the future, that vision that we set out for everyone to have line of sight, we can then build that powerful grassroots support that we need. And we can do that by activating people and getting all the groups in our organization to move up that activation curve together. Now, the question that often comes up is, well, how many people? What's the tipping point? How do we get there? So, how much is required to reach that tipping point for a movement? So, for those that were with us last week, we talked a little bit about this, but I'll bring back one slide from that conversation, which is we have some evidence around where the tipping point sits. We've got a long study done over 2 years of 60 large global organizations by McKinsey that studied basically how many folks in the organization you needed to engage to make a enterprise transformation effective. And the number is roughly 7% is the tipping point between failure and success. But importantly, as we go beyond 7%, the rate of success increases dramatically. So at that 14 to 20% level, we've actually increased our not success. The measurement here is total returns for shareholders, but we'll equate that to success. What that means is in those organizations that had 7% or more, those companies' returns were outsized relative to their peer group. And as they engaged even more in the organization, they got even higher returns. The spread between them and their peers separated. So the point being that if we're leading transformations and we are engaging more of our organization, we are more likely to build a competitive advantage over our competitors and generate outsized returns as a result, which oftentimes is the point of our transformation efforts. So there's a high correlation between engagement and achieving those outcomes and goals that we want. So if we look at the data around, well, what happens when leaders are engaged, we also see that there's a lot of support for this. So from the same source, if the C-suite is involved directly in leading from the front, your transformation effort that you're leading is 2.5 times more likely to succeed. So we know from lots of data, lots of studies, that in those that had executive sponsorship that was visible, present, engaged, that we had a 2.5 chance higher that we were going to actually be successful. And if the CEO himself, herself, themselves is engaged, it even goes up from there. So if the CEO is highly engaged, it increases to more than 3 times more likely to succeed. So why is this? I think this is probably intuitive, but nonetheless, it's important that it signals that this is an important thing to the organization. The organization, especially middle managers as well, are looking to executives to understand, is this a priority or not? It helps to align cross-functional priorities and resources. So if we do have lots of folks in a change campaign that are engaged, those folks have a coordination layer at the senior leadership level that can help us course correct and move very quickly. It helps us build trust and reinforces the why behind the change. So we've got these people out there as evangelists constantly saying, this is why we're doing it. This is what's in it for us. This is why it's going to be better. Come along on this journey with us. And when inevitably those challenges come up that are going to come up, it actually allows for faster decision making, right? So if we see that this group is getting it, but that group is not getting it, and we need to actually invest more in this group, we can now allocate those resources much more quickly because we've basically got the signing authority to make it happen, right? We can actually go get those resources, or we can shift those resources, or we can get the right people in the room at the right time to quickly make that pivot or that course correction that, if not addressed, might throw us off the course and stop our momentum. So we know that this is the case with this audience, and there's data to support that. So keep these numbers in your head because this is the kind of business case we want to build for our leadership. We also have the data of what happens if we have the other archetype. So in transformations where the C-suite was not visibly engaged, surprisingly, the opposite was true. Success rates, in fact, dropped below 30% in those cases. So we have basically the scorecard for these two archetypes, and we know what we're going to get. We can predictively say we know the kinds of outcomes that we're going to get, or at least how we're going to improve our odds if we can really engage executive leaders in this process. So some summary thoughts about this, and then I'm going to dive into some of those best practices that we talked about. We want to start reframing our work from change management to change leadership. So if we can start to really think about change leadership as our goal, we can start to think about how to build a culture of change leadership in our companies and make our organizations stronger and more competitive. It truly is a competitive advantage. Without it, there's three things that are very important that are going to happen. One, employees are going to view change as optional, right? If they see it as optional or disconnected from business outcomes or that, that death knell, just a flavor of the month, we're not going to get any traction. We're dead before we start. So change initiatives are often seen as side projects. Sometimes change initiatives aren't enterprise wide and they maybe don't justify C-suite sort of attention all the time. But for those transformations that are enterprise wide, we have to have their engagement. It has to be core to the business because when the C-suite leads from the front, it's going to signal that this change is mission critical and it's directly tied to our company's strategic priorities. The other thing that we see without it is that we end up with a do as I say, not as I do culture, meaning that we get these mixed messages, the cynicism, and that inconsistency when we look at what our leaders are doing. And if our leaders aren't walking the talk, we're not going to either. So people watch what the leaders do, not just what they say, and we want to make sure that our leaders are consistently modeling the desired behaviors, the new ways of working, the culture that we're trying to create, so that others see it as a cue of behavior and model it. And then lastly, without that change leadership, we also have the practical problem of disempowered change management teams. So if our change teams are hitting these roadblocks, if they're seeing these challenges, if they recognize a course correction and they don't have the power or the authority to make those course corrections, shift resources, reallocate resources, maybe increase resources if need be, then we're going to have that obstacle stop our momentum. If we engage those senior leaders in that process, we can move more quickly, right? We can actually get the empowerment we need to make the course corrections that are going to keep us on the path and get to the vision. And last thought, all these things are true, and middle managers are the amplifier, right? So the reason that we, I think, consistently agree that middle management is one of those critical layers is that we can't treat middle managers like they're just going to go do what we want. We have to persuade them too. We have to persuade those middle managers that this is the right thing to do, that this is the right thing for them, and we have to equip them with the skills and the toolkits to do these things. And importantly, the middle managers amplify it up or down, right? So if they don't see their leaders walking the talk, they're not going to walk the talk. If they don't see their leaders saying this is important, they're not going to say it's important. And they are going to amplify those leaders' messages up and down the line. So if we can get our leaders involved in role modeling the behaviors, middle management engaged to do the same thing, we're more likely to create that movement through the entire organization. But if we fail to engage this audience, we're going to stop it right there. So critical to think about how we apply these at both the layers of executive leadership and middle management. So with that point of view planted, what I'd love to do is now step into some best practices. So working with a number of folks, I won't call you out, but one of you is on the call. You know who you are. I've worked with a bunch of senior leaders in the organizations around the world that Explain touched in my work there, as well as in my work at Intuit and with Bain. And the observations that I'm sharing now are observations that I saw as sort of commonalities, if you will, in terms of those leaders that really did it well, some of the things that they did best. So if you are an executive leader or an executive sponsor, please think about putting these into your toolkit. Maybe not all of them are going to apply, but maybe a few of them are going to be your new superpower. And if you're a change leader who's whispering to that audience, these are the kinds of things we want to encourage them to start to do because we know that they work. So the first one of my personal favorites, make it visual. We talked in the envision phase about trying to reduce that strategy, that vision down to one page. And the bottom line is if you can't explain your vision in one page, you don't know it enough yourself to be able to tell the story. You need to get your entire leadership team around a common vision. What is the vision of where we're headed? How are we going there? What's my common story to tell that? Can I do the same degree of synthesis around our strategy? Can I boil a strategy down to a page so that I can get everyone in my organization to start to understand, at least at the highest level, what we're doing and why, and give them a gateway to ask the questions to say, tell me more, right? It's kind of like the equivalent of an elevator pitch. We don't want to go out and tell people the entire thesis because they're not ready for that. We need to give them a gateway to be able to understand the fundamentals before they can start to engage in the learning process and move up that activation curve. Bonus points for you if, like a lot of my past favorite leaders, You actually take the time to actually go put this out on the wall, put it up on your internet, carry it with you into meetings, make it a slide that's always in your deck, right? Because the more you can share that story and the more that you can help your other middle managers and leaders tell that story in a consistent way, you've given your entire organization a script. Second one, make it measurable. So this sounds obvious, like, okay, Aric, we do measurement all the time, but in change, we usually measure KPIs, right? We're having conversations with the CFO around, what's happening with cost savings, what's happening with sales and revenue growth, what's happening with our NPS score. As change activators, what we need to be thinking about also is what are the other things that we can measure? What are the qualitative and quantitative measurements along the journey that we can use to build our case that these are leading indicators leading to those KPIs? So we need to start looking at things like activation, engagement, people's sentiment, the types of reactions that are giving us clues as to whether or not these messages are hitting, whether people are understanding the what, the why, and the how, and they're moving forward into a movement together. If we start to see those things, that can become data and evidence that will help us build our movement. And as people see that we're moving, others will join. So we want to make it measurable from the start. We want to understand the qualitative and quantitative measures all along the journey. And we want to be making them very transparent so that they can actually help us accelerate the building of that movement. There's a lot of data and a lot of studies that suggest that once you get to about 20% of the organization that are moving in a direction, the remaining people on the fence will join. So we want to get to that tipping point, and measurement is a key skill. One CEO that I worked with that did this really, really well actually made a simple slide the core of every single all hands meeting. It was a picture of the journey from point A to point B that they were going to go on, their expected measurements along the route, and then their actual results. And every month, the CEO stood up and said, "Here's where we're at. Here's what we did last month. Here's where we're going next. And we've had great success in this area, and we need to work harder in this area." And that rhythm over the course of 12 to 18 months got them to their destination faster than they planned. But it was a conversation that was ongoing and constant. Practice three, we want to make it people centered. So, obviously, if you've been on this journey with me already, you've already heard this, but I think it's so important that we start to think about shifting from a process-driven approach to a people-centered approach. We need to persuade our peers that we're in a different type of organization than the one we used to be. We have empowered people with agency who are thoughtful, who need to be persuaded to join our change, and that we need to actually build a campaign that is tailored to the different wants and needs of those stakeholder groups. So we can't have those one size fits none plans anymore. We really need to think about what are the different groups in my organization? How do they feel about this change? And what's unique about them that I might need to address? Does this group need more training and support because we're asking them to do something new that they've never done before? Does this group need more help understanding the business case, the what and the why of it? We need to actually tailor a campaign specifically to the people in our organization in those key stakeholder groups. My personal favorite, co-creation. So co-creation can be a superpower. And if you think about employee engagement being one of the big challenges that we have, co-creation is the antidote. If we can bring our key stakeholder groups that we're dependent on for our change into the room as early as possible, even in the strategy making if we can. But if not, once we have a strategy, bring people in and say, what do you think about it? What works? What's different? Help us make it better. Any place that we can in our process of activating change that we can engage stakeholders in a conversation, we're going to, number one, learn new things because oftentimes we as leaders can't see as far as the people that are on the ground. They've got insights, they've got ideas. They might take our raw blueprint and help us design one that's even better. So we'll get insights from them. And number two, and really critically to the change effort, people support that which they've been engaged in. So if you throw a plan over the wall, I didn't touch that, my fingerprints aren't on it, people are going to reject it. But if you engage them and you say, hey, help me make this better, you're going to get better ideas. And also that person's going to walk out now saying, I own part of this. This is partly for me. That is going to build that momentum. One of the I can say this one publicly. CEO of Rocket, a large mid-market software firm owned by a private equity firm, um, brought in basically after the vision and strategy was developed, uh, took it back from that 100-page PowerPoint deck and just turned it into kind of a schematic drawing, those one pagers that we talked about, the vision and the strategy, and brought all the senior leaders in to say, hey, here's what we're thinking of doing. Here's a red pen. Go to it. What do you love about it? What don't you like about it? What did we miss? And all of those leaders got engaged in a conversation around how to make that plan better. And it ended up being better and it ended up being successful because those folks all had a hand in it. And then they became change ambassadors. So that whole middle management layer and that senior layer was activated just by that very simple act of co-creation. Practice 5, activate people with a campaign, right? This is the core message of this entire program. But you need to think about change like you think about a marketing plan. How do we actually start to build a change campaign that's targeted our particular target customers, if you will, employee groups, stakeholder groups, with the specific interventions and building blocks that they need in the right order at the right time to get them to move to action and go up that activation curve from hearing it and being aware of it to understanding it and applying it to integrating those new ways of working. We know that if you invest the money in, and I say it quite clearly, the money and the resources to do a change activation plan, you're more likely to be in that audience of success than you are in those audiences that don't make that investment. Practice 6, designing governance. So we talked about this a little bit last week. And when we say governance, I'm not just saying, hey, have a team of people in charge. We need to build a system to sense and respond. So it's really important that we have a simple plan with milestones, like that CEO that I mentioned that brought it into that picture into the all hands. And we use that actively to understand where are we at today? Can we measure where we are versus where we expected to be? And then can we make decisions about how we need to course correct? And do we have the right group of people that are empowered to do that? So at the very start, we want to go back to our last webinar and talk about how do we build a light and fast enough governance model that's as simple as possible, but no simpler, that's empowered to make the course corrections that we need. And related, we also need to work with our teams to embrace the cultural concept of embracing agility. So while we know that we're going to need to have a governance model that measures where we're at and helps us in an empowered way to make those course corrections, we also want to, at a cultural level, and I've seen the best leaders do this, intervene with their audiences to say, hey, folks, I don't know it all. I don't know where we're going because we've never been here before. We're leading to a new place. So we're going to learn together. And I like to say that you should plan on your plan not working as planned, right? We know no plan survives first contact. But if leaders can be vulnerable, as I've seen the best ones do it, and say, we're going to a brand new place and none of us knows the answers, but we're going to learn together, we can build a culture that can understand where we're going, provide the feedback, allow us to see those obstacles and mitigate them very, very quickly, and move to a new place faster. And not only are those things that pop up sometimes going to be obstacles, but sometimes they're going to be accelerants, right? We might find that we've got a chute or a ladder instead of a big boulder in front of us, and we might be able to go faster. So we want to engage the entire organization in this, and we want leaders from the front to be building that mindset around agility and really making it the adventure that it is, which is moving to a completely new place. So in closing, before we do some Q&A, I just want to leave you with this thought. I really believe this. I believe that a leader's ability to navigate change by motivating people to achieve an organization's purpose is the single most important driver of a leader's impact. In this world that we're living in right now, change is not only a constant, it's an accelerating constant. And if leaders can build this muscle, if leaders can get great at doing this, leaders are going to be more effective than their peers. And ultimately, the impact that they're going to get is going to be related to how quickly they can scale change in their organization, how quickly they can persuade people to join a movement to move towards a new vision. So I hope that this has been of value to folks. This is really, for me, the most fun to talk about because I've seen these things working and I've seen the leaders that have gotten there that are in that rare group of people that have been successful in transformation. And they've all gotten very good at doing these things. So I hope that you can find ways to share this with your peers. The key takeaways I want to plant. For us change practitioners, one of the things that we need, the muscle we need to build almost probably more than anything else is building the business case for change. And while we're doing that, building that business case for change and going to our leaders and saying, this is why it's important, we also, from the start, want to explicitly tie success to change leadership from the C-suite. If we're leading an enterprise-wide change, we need to let them know right out of the gates, these numbers I'm putting in front of you are only going to be achieved if you're my partner in this. Secondly, to get them on board, we want to make it easy for them. So we want to work with our leaders to develop common vision maps, strategy maps, storylines, presentations, FAQs, those things that are going to get that leadership team to have a common script. And we want them to be able to say that story consistently. And if we make it easy for them, it'll get easy for them to rehearse it and just make it their own, right? So we want to have a common script, but we want them to take that script and make it authentic and make it their own. And then importantly, lastly, we want to also facilitate how middle management engages with the C-suite leaders to co-create and refine the what, the why, and the how. Remember that example I mentioned of Rocket, where the senior leader said, I'm going to bring this whole group together and we're going to have this conversation as a group about where we're headed, why we're headed there, and what are their ideas to actually make it better. If they can facilitate, if we can facilitate the process of that happening, right? That middle management layer is more likely to be engaged because they've both seen that it's important to senior leadership, they've been equipped with the tools, and they've been engaged in the process of helping making it better, meaning their fingerprints on it, and they're going to then have some sense of ownership, which will accelerate change leadership. For C-suite leaders, if you're an executive or if you're an executive whisperer, the three things I want them to take away is this. Number one, evangelize the change as a priority. So when you're leading from the front, it's going to signal that this is mission critical and this is important to the organization. And if you're not saying it, more importantly, people are going to ignore the change. So you need to be reminding people how important this is and evangelize it constantly. Secondly, your own behaviors need to be a role model for the new ways of working. So if you're asking people to do something different on Monday morning than the way they used to do it, then you need to do it first because everyone's looking to you to see if this is real and important or not, and they're going to model your behaviors. And then thirdly, make sure that you're there to empower rapid decision making and course correction. So this executive group is one of the very few groups that actually can cut across all the silos, that can actually break down those barriers, that can reallocate resources and do it quickly. And speed is your necessary friend in change. We're trying to build a movement, we're trying to build momentum. Anything that slows a movement down is likely to kill it. So we need to make sure that we are agile and quick and able to make change and make course corrections quickly. And usually it's executive leadership that has the power to actually cut across all those layers and make that happen and empower leaders to actually make the course corrections that are required. So with that, I'd love to take maybe 5 minutes or so and hear any questions folks have or also comments. If Julie, if you've seen any comments in there that people have shared that you think other people might benefit from, let's dive into the chat and both share questions and any comments that people may have.
Perfect. Let's start with Nora then. She said, I've seen a one pager in our change activities, but it was so complex that that it was not clearly understandable without a lot of explanation. So I guess maybe one question that you could tackle, and I think I'm interested too in this question, is like, how do you create a simple image then from a very complex, large transformation?
I love that question. So, for those of you who are familiar with Explain, the origin of Explain, one of my former employers was we had the trademark, the Visual Thinking Company. And the concept was very simply that you can pack a lot of information into a visual that is more powerful than words themselves. So, my answer first would be strip away the words, right? What I've seen one pagers, I've seen a lot of strategy one pagers, but they typically look like an overpacked PowerPoint chart. Lots of words, lots of bullets. Take the words off the page. If you have to, get out a pencil and start sketching a picture of it. And what I ask leaders to do, and it's always an uncomfortable first thing I do when I sit down with leaders, I'll say, I want you to actually draw me a picture of your vision. Don't use words, use stick figures, whatever, but show me a picture of what the future is going to look like, and then tell me a story. And if they can do that, if they can actually draw out a picture of the future and they can tell me a story about this is where we're going, this is why we're going, this is how it's going to be better for our customers, this is how it's going to be better for our partners, they can create a story that's very authentic and meaningful. and is a lot more powerful than all those words on the page. Then from there, you can build that up to a one-page map that basically maybe just has some of the words that are anchors, right? So maybe the strategy has three parts to it, and you label those three parts, but you equip the senior leader with the talking notes to say what's underneath that. But again, we want that one-page picture just to be a gateway. We want it to be almost a visual script to simply say, this is where we're headed. This is the path we're going to take to get there. These are the three things we need to do. And this is what I'm asking of you. We want to boil it down. So I encourage people to basically strip back the words to the essence, try to make it a visual picture. And then that visual picture can ultimately be the visual script that senior leaders can use to tell a consistent story. Love that question. Also, by the way, I've seen a lot of people actually then once they produce those, they put them up on the wall. People walk by, they talk about it, they point at it. It's another way to engage employees as well.
Perfect. So, I have another question, this one from Ian. What kinds of resistance do you see from senior leaders that hold them back from turning into activators? For example, a leader may feel they're empowering their team by being a delegator, or they don't want to be seen as toxic for being over involved. Any feedback for helping leaders break through resistance and then becoming then those activators?
That's a really great question, Ian, because there is that tension between I don't want to micromanage my team and I want to delegate to them, right? But you got to think of it, and the way I like to explain it to leaders is like think of it as the air cover, though, right? I try to avoid military analogies, but this makes sense for a lot of leaders. You know, we're asking our folks to go out and do something, but we're not giving them any support or any cover, right? And what we need to do is actually help our leaders recognize that by being evangelists for what we're delegating we're actually supporting those efforts on the ground. So we want to basically encourage our leaders to understand that they are the signal that tells the organization what's important. You can't just delegate it and then leave the team to their own devices because they may not be as successful as they could be if you can be actively supporting them with your words and your actions. They don't necessarily have to be in the trenches doing the work, but their words and their actions matter, and their words and their actions are signals to the organization of what's important and whether what you're saying is authentic and what you're doing is authentic and whether other people should follow your lead. So the leadership part of it isn't actually the execution part of it necessarily. The leadership part of it really comes down to convincing and supporting our leaders and presenting their words and action in support of our efforts. And that's something that they should be able to do in their everyday without it being an additional lift. Thank you for that question. I think that is a real challenge sometimes.
Think we're good on questions for now.
Okay. Well, I will then, if folks have other questions or comments, please shoot them out. We'll definitely, as we have been, share some of the content for folks. One thing before we depart, so we finished our series. We've got three offers and an ask for you today. The ask is that we want to constantly make sure that we're learning from you and we're engaging in two-way conversations and we're getting feedback. So when we close this meeting, you will have a pop-up survey that's going to ask you to just give us some insights. What resonated for you? What didn't resonate for you? What can we do differently maybe next time that we do another series of these? So we want to make sure that these are a resource and your feedback will help us make it better. So please give us the gift of feedback. And then secondly, a couple of offers. So for those of you who've been along on the journey, we've covered a lot of content, a lot of theory, a lot of practice. If people are working on a change challenge or people just want to dive more deeply into the content, I'm available to you. So I would like to make sure that if you have questions that you'd like to talk about, I'm available for my office hours. I put a link in the chat. Go ahead and hit that. You can sign up for 30 minutes and we can just talk about any topic you're interested in related to this or your own change challenges. I'm happy to unpack some of the exercises, some of the tools, whatever is of service to you. So please go ahead and do that. Secondly, if you are interested in learning a little bit about how Tigerhall actually supports change activation at scale, we haven't talked much about Tigerhall and its work, but we're basically a technology platform that supports change activation. So if people are interested in seeing a demo, again, just hit me on that calendar and I'll bring someone in to actually sit down and actually show us how this might work with enabled technology. And then lastly, I know a lot of folks have seen the book, but if you haven't, most of the content we're talking about today is coming from the strategy activation playbook that I wrote. Because you've been so generous with your time, if you don't already have a copy, shoot me an email and I'd be happy to send out a copy to you. I really wrote this book as a playbook. It was meant to be a toolkit that you can use to start to apply these kinds of techniques in your daily work. So I would love to give back the gift of your time by sharing the book with you. Just shoot me an email at my address. It's eric@tigerhall.com. Give me your mailing address, and I will send you a copy, and would look forward to hopefully seeing some of these practices more actively engaged in your organizations. And with that, I just want to thank you. This has been an amazing experience for me, and I'm looking forward to our next series that'll be coming up in the summertime. Love to keep the conversation going with you, and I thank you all for making positive change in the world.
I think we have one last question if we want to squeeze it in before the hour's up. Are you
Sure.
down? Okay, perfect.
I'm done.
Uh, do you start seeing the tendency of larger organizations starting to move back to the old style of change, cascade, top-down guidance, and leaders believe this will work rather than moving forward in the way that is recommended here? I feel there is a mirror where organizations start picking up the outside world's tendencies.
I think the only thing I would say is that if people are taking advantage of the fact that we now have better data and analytics to track success, that anyone that makes that mistake is going to more quickly pivot back to the newer ways of working. That's my hope. I think that that's one of the reasons, for example, that I am such an advocate now of using technology-enabled change, because for the first time, we as change leaders actually have the data and the analytics at our fingertips to be able to make better business cases for what's working and what's not. And there are times where sometimes an organization might need to take a more hierarchical approach. But by and large, those are rare exceptions, and the data will tell us the truth. So, as change leaders, if you can find the ways to get the data to make your business case, you can make the case for what's working and what's not with honesty. And I predict that more and more of us are going to be following this new, more modern approach to change that's people centered, human centered, and activated from within rather than that traditional tops down cascade. So, thank you for that question. That's actually a great one to close on. Thanks, all.